I was sold to the wealthiest family in the country as a companion for their daughter, just to keep my father's firm from going under. Miriam Harrison was a socialite in every sense of the word, born into a legacy of power and 3 years my junior. Yet she was wild and completely untamable. Initially, I was nothing more than her live-in playmate, spending my days gaming with her or skipping classes to mess around in her private home theater where our physical boundaries became non-existent. As the years passed, our roles shifted into a dual life where I was her professional assistant by day and her exclusive possession by night. We left our mark everywhere, from the floor to ceiling windows of her executive suite to the cabins of her private jet and the decks of her yacht. Everything changed the day her first love returned to the States. That night, she was insatiable, clinging to me for hours as if trying to drown out a memory she wasn't ready to face. "Edward," she whispered against my ear, "I still can't get Justin out of my head." In that moment, I realized my role in her life had finally reached its expiration date. I told her I understood and would have my things packed and my security access deleted within the hour. Miriam just chuckled and pulled me into a familiar embrace, telling me not to be dramatic because only our extracurricular activities were ending. She promised I would remain her lead assistant and that she would continue to bankroll my family's safety for the rest of our lives. I finished buttoning my dress shirt and turned to meet her gaze with a finality she didn't expect. I told her that wouldn't be necessary because I had already decided to resign, but my words were cut short by the trill of her phone. Her best friend was on the other end, shouting with manic excitement that Justin was back and throwing a massive homecoming party at a lounge called Noir. Miriam's entire face transformed as she scrambled to get ready, rushing out the door without a second glance at me. The second the door clicked shut, I moved with practiced efficiency to strip the bed and toss the linens into the hamper. I spent a few minutes gathering the designer clothes scattered across the floor and hanging them back in her walk-in closet. When the room was finally pristine, I turned to my own life and realized that after 3 years in this mansion, everything I actually owned fit into a single carry-on bag. I felt a strange sense of relief as I zipped the suitcase shut. I was standing at the entrance, deleting my fingerprint access from the smart lock when my father called, his voice trembling with manic joy. He demanded to know what I had done to please Miriam this time, because she had just transferred $100 million into his struggling accounts. I stared at the luxury foyer and spoke with a detachment that made me feel like a ghost in my own life. I told him this was the final payment he would ever receive from her. I informed him that Miriam was finished with us and would never invest another cent into his failures. My father went silent for a heartbeat before his voice turned sharp and desperate, asking me what the hell I was talking about. He started rambling about how I had spent a decade making myself indispensable to her, and that Justin's return shouldn't change my position. He insisted that I stay on as her assistant, so our family could continue to leech off her wealth. I cut him off mid-sentence to let him know that I was done being his sacrifice. For 12 years, he had used my mother's medical bills to blackmail me into this life, but now that she had passed away, he had no leverage left. I warned him never to contact me again, or I would find a way to claw back every dollar he had spent on himself. I hung up, blocked his number on everything from my message to Facebook, and headed to the Harrison Group headquarters to officially end my career. The HR director looked at me like I had just confessed to a murder when I handed him my resignation letter. He stammered, asking if Miriam was aware of this, but I simply told him that turnover was a natural part of business. He argued that the company would grind to a halt without me managing her life, but I pushed the paperwork across his desk. I told him that no one is truly indispensable and instructed him to process the request through the portal for her final sign-off. Just before the end of the day, the HR manager caught me in the lobby to tell me that Miriam had already approved the request. He hesitated, mentioning that she likely hadn't even looked at the name on the digital form before clicking accept. I told him not to bother informing her because I wanted the process to remain strictly professional. I knew Miriam was likely still recovering from Justin's party and wouldn't be bothered with office minutiae while she was riding her high. Miriam didn't show her face at the office for the next 48 hours, which gave me plenty of time to finalize my visa paperwork. I spent my evenings methodically scrubbing my apartment of her presence, packing away every trace of the life I had led. I left behind the luxury watches, the keys to the various supercars she had gifted me, and every expensive trinket she had tossed my way during her fleeting moments of affection. I wanted to enter my new life with nothing that belonged to her. On the third evening, my phone buzzed with an iMessage from an unknown contact that made my blood run cold. The sender claimed to know all about my history with Miriam, but warned me that she belonged to him now, and I was nothing more than an aging, incompetent loser. I was about to type a response when Miriam's name flashed on the screen with an an incoming call. Her voice was uncharacteristically bright as she told me to come down to the street immediately. A sleek black Maybach was idling at the curb when I stepped outside. Miriam looked stunning in a floral sundress, leaning against the door as the afternoon sun filtered through the trees and illuminated her face. For a fleeting second, I was transported back to when she was a teenager waiting for me outside the gates of her prep school. She caught my eye and gestured for me to get in, telling me she had somewhere special to take me. I was surprised when she pulled into the parking lot of a high-end luxury mall on Fifth Avenue. She dragged me from one designer boutique to another, holding up expensive suits and coats against my frame to check the fit. I stood there like a mannequin, feeling a strange hollowness as I stared at my reflection in the expensive mirrors. My brief moment of confusion ended when she leaned in and whispered that none of these clothes were actually for me. She told me that since I had the same build as Justin, I was merely acting as a fit model for his new wardrobe. I went still as the realization hit me that I was shopping for my replacement. I asked her if they were officially a couple, and she beamed with a radiant smile I hadn't seen in years. She confessed that she had poured her heart out at the party and found that Justin had been pining for her just as long, but was too intimidated to speak up. She rambled on about their misconnections and fate, sounding exactly like the love-struck teenager she used to be. I listened to her talk while the memory of that hateful iMessage played on a loop in my head. The pieces finally clicked together, and the sender's identity became painfully obvious. I interrupted her honeymoon phase to ask what exactly she saw in him that made him so special. She didn't hesitate to tell me that he was the most gentle and considerate man she had ever met, unlike everyone else. I found it hard to reconcile her gentle Justin with the man who had just texted me calling me a pathetic, impotent loser. I couldn't help but frown because the word gentle seemed like a massive stretch for a man capable of such venom. After a long silence, I cautiously suggested that Justin might not be the saint she imagined him to be. The joy vanished from her face instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp gaze that could have cut glass. She reminded me that I needed to remember my place and warned me not to let my jealousy turn into pathetic attempts to ruin her happiness. Even at her young age, Miriam possessed the crushing aura of a Harrison air that could make the room feel devoid of oxygen. I realized I had crossed an invisible line and offered a quiet apology before deciding to keep the text to myself. We were driving back in a heavy silence when her phone shattered the tension with an incoming call from Justin. His voice was frantic over the speakerphone, screaming that he had been kidnapped and needed her help immediately. Miriam's composure broke instantly as she pulled out a second phone to track his GPS signal. The moment the coordinate appeared, she wrenched the steering wheel in a violent U-turn without checking for traffic. The force of the maneuver sent me flying into the passenger side window before I could even brace myself. I felt a sudden warmth blooming on my forehead, and when I reached up to touch it, my hand came away soaked in crimson. Miriam didn't even glance my way as she floored the accelerator, driving like a maniac toward the hotel where Justin was being held. When we reached the roof, we found a middle-aged man holding a serrated knife to Justin's throat, his eyes filled with the desperation of someone who had lost everything. He was a former executive whose life had been dismantled by the Harrison Group's recent hostile takeovers. He screamed that since Miriam had destroyed his home, he was going to make her feel the agony of losing the person she loved most. I pressed my hand against the gash on my head, watching as Miriam's fear morphed into a chilling, calculated smile. She told the man that business was a blood sport and that losing was just part of the game he had chosen to play. She mocked him for being a sore loser while her hand tightened around my bicep with a strength that surprised me. I realized then that she wasn't looking at Justin. She was looking at the man with the knife. Miriam pointed a finger at me and told the kidnapper that he had the wrong man if he wanted to hurt her. She claimed that Justin was a nobody and that I was the one who actually held her heart. She whispered in my ear to ignore the scene and just walk with her, but she made sure her movements were slow and deliberate. I knew her well enough to recognize a trap when I saw one. As we turned to leave, I realized she was serving me up as a sacrificial lamb to save Justin. The kidnapper fell for it instantly, shoving Justin to the ground and lunging at me with all his weight. Before I could even defend myself, he had me in a chokehold and was dragging me toward the ledge of the 20-story building. I could feel the cold wind at my back and the desperate strength in the man's trembling hands. Miriam's voice pierced the air, screaming my name with a raw, primal terror that sounded almost genuine. It didn't matter though, because my momentum carried us both over the low security railing. I felt the sickening drop in my stomach as gravity took hold and the world began to rush past me in a blur of wind and city lights. Falling from that height was a brief brief journey, and I expected to meet the pavement in a matter of heartbeats. As I plummeted, my final thought was of the girl I had spent 12 years protecting and how she had finally become a woman capable of cold-blooded betrayal. When my eyes finally opened, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room blinded me. A nurse let out a sigh of relief, telling me that I was a miracle because the blood loss from the head wound and the internal injuries should have killed me. I was lucky that a safety net on the 10th floor had broken my fall, though my body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. The nurse mentioned that my girlfriend had been hysterical, summoning every specialist in the city and threatening to buy the entire hospital just to ensure I lived. I struggled to speak through a throat that felt like it was filled with glass, rasping out the truth that Miriam was not my girlfriend. We were absolutely nothing to each other, a statement that was met with a slammed door as Miriam appeared at the threshold. Her face was a mask of fury as she demanded to know exactly what I meant by saying we were nothing. Sensing the impending explosion, the nurse quickly finished her rounds and vanished from the room. Miriam approached the bed, her eyes burning as she studied my battered face and asked if I was angry about the rooftop. I told her I wasn't angry because I had no right to be, considering my position in her life. She bit her lip and justified her actions by saying that as her boyfriend, Justin's safety was her primary responsibility. I offered a weak, bloodless smile and told her it was perfectly logical to prioritize the man she loved over a hired hand. My lack of emotion seemed to frustrate her more than a screaming match would have. She had come there expecting me to be hurt so she could comfort me, but my clinical acceptance of being discarded left her looking rattled. She asked if I truly believed what I was saying, and my simple nod caused a visible wave of irritation to wash over her. I decided to twist the knife further by suggesting she go check on Justin since the ordeal must have been traumatic for someone as sensitive as him. She stared at me in silence for a long time before turning on her heel and stalking out of the room with a frigid expression. Instead of heading to Justin's wing, she walked to a secluded corner of the hallway and dialed her friend's number. She looked confused and restless, as if something in her world had shifted and she couldn't find her footing. Miriam asked her friend what it meant when a man who used to be devoted to you suddenly stopped showing any signs of jealousy. She described my behavior as if she were talking about a broken machine that refused to work the way it always had. Her friend laughed over the line and joked that it obviously meant I had fallen even deeper in love with her. Miriam snapped at her to take the question seriously, but her friend just kept teasing her about my supposed undying loyalty. Her friend explained that jealousy was for kids and that real, mature love was quiet and selfless. She told Miriam that I was likely so in love with her that I was willing to suppress my own pain just to see her happy with Justin. This explanation seemed to soothe the fire in Miriam's chest, and a smug smile returned to her lips. She was so relieved that she promised her friend the luxury sports car she had been eyeing as a reward for the advice. Her friend was ecstatic, joking that her insights were worth millions and that she was available for consultation whenever Miriam needed more ego stroking. Miriam hung up feeling like she was walking on air, fully convinced that I was still her loyal servant who would never leave. She began humming a tune to herself as she finally made her way to Justin's room to play the role of the devoted girlfriend. While recovering, I kept seeing Justin's posts on Instagram where he played the victim, claiming he was plagued by nightmares of the kidnapping. He posted about how Miriam was taking him to the Maldives to help him recover for the trauma of seeing someone get hurt. He shared a photo of her feeding him grapes on the jet, both of them looking blissfully happy. I scrolled past it without a hint of emotion, glad that he was keeping her occupied so I could plan my escape in peace. Miriam was nowhere to be found on the day I checked out of the hospital because her Facebook was full of photos from a ski trip in the Alps. I checked the calendar and realized I only had 72 hours left until my resignation became official. I went home and packed my life into a single suitcase once more, leaving behind everything she had ever bought me. I was about to call my landlord to cancel the lease when my phone rang, vibrating against the empty desk. It was Miriam, and for once, her voice was thick with genuine terror as she told me to get to the Azure Lounge immediately because Justin had done something terrible. The scene was chaotic when I arrived, with a totaled Ferrari sitting in the middle of the street and a body lying in a pool of spreading blood. Justin was cowering behind Miriam, his face drained of color as he stared at the carnage he had caused. Miriam shoved a glass of whiskey into my hand and told me that Justin had been driving drunk and hit a pedestrian. She explained that he was too fragile to handle the legal consequences and demanded that I take the fall for him. She promised it would only be a couple of days in holding while her high-priced lawyers handled the paperwork and swept everything under the rug. She looked at me with a cold expectation, as if my freedom was just another resource resource for her to manage. I looked her in the eyes and asked what would happen if I refused to be her scapegoat. Her voice dropped to a threatening chill as she reminded me that she wasn't asking for my permission. She was giving me an order as my employer. I stared at her for a moment before letting out a dry laugh and accepting the whiskey, draining it in one go despite my severe allergy. I could already feel the hives beginning to bloom on my skin as the police sirens drew closer. When the cops arrived, I reeked of booze and confessed to being behind the wheel, leading to swift arrest. The next 48 hours were a living hell as I was thrown into a maximum security holding cell packed with violent offenders. A massive tattooed man approached me with a predatory grin, mocking me for my clean clothes and handsome face. I suspected Justin had made a few calls to ensure my stay was as miserable as possible. The man slammed my head into the concrete wall before I could even respond, sneering that he heard I had been giving Miriam's new boyfriend a hard time. I tried to fight back, but 3 other inmates jumped in, pinning me down and kicking me repeatedly until I couldn't breathe. One of them spat on me and called me a piece of garbage, laughing about how a lowlife like me thought I could compete with a man like Justin. They were clearly paid to break me. I endured the beating in silence, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream as the agony radiated through my ribs. The bruises were all hidden beneath my shirt, a secret testament to the price I was paying for Justin's mistake. When Miriam finally showed up to bail me out on the 3rd morning, she seemed genuinely shocked by my appearance. She asked me why I looked so haggard, unaware of the violence she had facilitated. Part of me wanted to scream the truth at her and show her the marks on my body, but I realized it didn't matter because I was leaving her world forever. She apologized for the inconvenience and reached out to touch my cheek, but I flinched away before she could make contact. Her hand hung in the air as she explained that she would have come sooner if Justin hadn't come down with a sudden fever. She chose his minor illness over my freedom while I was being beaten in a cell. It was almost poetic that a slight fever was enough for her to leave me in a cage for 2 extra days. I let out a dry, bitter laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears and walked past her without saying a single word. She chased after me and tried to drag me toward her car, insisting that she take me home to rest. I pulled my arm away and told her in a flat voice that she was taking me to the office instead. She frowned and told me I was in no condition to work, but I repeated my demand with a cold authority that made her go quiet. She seemed to remember all the times I had worked through sickness and injury just to ensure her business deals were successful. When we arrived at the Harrison Group Tower, I unbuckled my seatbelt and prepared to leave the vehicle. I didn't look at her, my focus entirely on the exit. Miriam offered to come up to the office with me, but I refused her help as I opened the door to the biting morning air. Before I could step out, Justin's voice blared through her car's speakers, whining about a stomachache and begging her to come back to him. The sound of his voice was the final push I needed to step out into the cold. I felt nothing but a strange, icy clarity as I stood on the sidewalk. Miriam looked torn for a split second, her eyes darting between me and her phone as Justin continued to complain. I told her to go to him, maintaining a professional mask as I promised to head home after I finished my business. She apologized again for everything that had happened recently and reached out for my face one last time. I shifted my head just enough to avoid her hand, making it look like a casual movement. As she rolled up the window, she promised she would find a way to make it up to me once Justin was feeling better. I stood on the pavement and watched her luxury car disappear into the New York traffic, knowing I would never see it again. I walked into the building, finalized my remaining paperwork, and said goodbye to a few coworkers before heading home to grab my bag. I didn't hesitate as I hailed a cab and told the driver to take me straight to JFK. I stood at the gate and deleted every piece of contact information I had for her before snapping my SIM card and dropping it into a trash bin. As the plane ascended into the clouds, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying for over a decade. I had spent 12 years as her shadow, but as the city lights faded below, I whispered a final goodbye into the empty air. I was finally free of the Harrison legacy. Miriam found Justin huddled on his designer sofa, looking pathetic as he reached out for her like a lost child. She helped him up without a word, supporting his weight as they made their way to the elevator. Justin leaned into her, inhaling her expensive perfume with a smirk of satisfaction that she couldn't see. He had one, and he knew exactly how to keep her wrapped around his finger. Miriam kept a concerned expression on her face as she promised him he would be okay once they reached the specialists. She drove like a demon through Manhattan, blowing past red lights until she screeched to a halt at the entrance of a prestigious private clinic. The hospital's director was already waiting on the curb with a team of orderlies, ready to cater to the Sterling heir's every whim. Justin was whisked away on a stretcher while Miriam handled the intake. The diagnostic diagnostic results were underwhelming, showing nothing more than a mild case of gastritis. Miriam was skeptical, demanding to know if there were any hidden complications that the doctors had missed. The lead physician was visibly sweating as he assured her that Justin was fine and just needed a simple treatment plan. Miriam didn't care about the cost and ordered them to fly an experimental medication from Europe, treating a minor stomachache like a terminal illness. Justin basked in the attention as he listened to Miriam throw money at his recovery, feeling a smug warmth in his chest. He tugged on her sleeve and told her not to worry so much, playing the role of the brave patient to perfection. Miriam sat by his side and promised not to leave him, spending the next 72 hours glued to his bedside. She catered to his every whim, ignoring the world outside that hospital room. She hand-fed him every meal and personally administered his medication as if he were an invalid. She hovered over him constantly, adjusting his pillows if he so much as shifted in his sleep. When he mentioned an obscure soup shop in the Upper West Side, she had it delivered by a private courier within the hour. No request was too small or too expensive for her to fulfill. She filled his suite with thousands of dollars worth of fresh lilies when he complained about the clinical smell of the hospital. When he mentioned he was bored, she bought him a limited edition Lamborghini and had it parked in the hospital's private garage just so he could look at it. The Manhattan elite were buzzing with gossip about how the Harrison heiress was treating her new boyfriend like royalty. She was making a spectacle of her devotion, seemingly trying to prove something to herself. Miriam was there to drive him home the moment he was cleared for discharge. As they pulled out of the clinic, Justin mentioned how empty his apartment felt and how much he hated being alone. He turned bright red as he nervously asked if they could take the next step in their relationship. He suggested moving into her mansion, claiming it would make him feel safer after the kidnapping. Miriam's grip on the steering wheel tightened as a fleeting memory of my empty room in her mansion crossed her mind. She pushed the thought aside and agreed to his proposal, deciding that having him around would be the best way to move on. Justin was ecstatic, moving his designer luggage into her home before the sun had even set. He acted like he had finally claimed the throne he deserved. Justin immediately began demanding changes to the interior design, wanting to replace the furniture and color schemes to suit his own taste. He suggested white velvet sofas and navy curtains, stripping away the minimalist aesthetic I had carefully curated for her over the years. Miriam agreed to every single request, allowing him to erase my touch from the house. However, once the renovations were complete, she stood in the foyer and felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of wrongness in the air. I had spent years meticulously choosing every piece of furniture and decor to match her exact habits and comforts. Justin noticed her hesitation and asked if she was unhappy with the new look of the mansion. Miriam quickly forced a smile and threw her arms around him, assuring him that she loved everything he had done. She tried to convince herself that this new version of her home was exactly what she wanted. She whispered that she loved whatever he loved, fully committing to the charade of domestic bliss. Justin used his supposed recovery as leverage to keep her away from the Harrison group, demanding her constant presence at home. Miriam obliged, spending her days taking him to exclusive social clubs and private galleries that were closed to the general public. She was neglecting her empire to play house with a man who thrived on her attention. During a high-stakes auction at Sotheby's, she dropped $10 million on an ancient vase just because Justin had glanced at it for too long. She even poached a head chef from a 3-star Michelin restaurant after Justin mentioned he enjoyed a specific meal there. The story of her extravagance was the talk of every gala in New York, with people marveling at how she had completely spoiled him. It seemed there were no limits to what she would do to keep him satisfied. One evening, Justin appeared at her bedroom door in a silk robe, asking if he could stay the night with her. Miriam was focused on her laptop and only gave him a fleeting glance before telling him to return to his guest suite. Justin's lower lip trembled as he asked if she had already grown tired of him. He was playing the part of the wounded lover, trying to guilt her into letting him in. Miriam stood up and wrapped him in a consoling hug, giving him a gentle, lingering kiss to prove her affection. She pulled away once she felt things becoming too heated, cupping his face in her hands with a soft expression. She told him that she cherished him too much to rush things and wanted to save their first night together for their wedding. It was a sweet sentiment, but it felt hollow even to her own ears as she said it. Justin finally relented and said goodnight, leaving her alone in the massive master bedroom. Miriam lay in the dark staring at the ornate ceiling, unable to find the sleep that usually came so easily. Suddenly, a memory of our first night together flooded her mind with vivid, uncomfortable detail. She had been completely wasted that night, and the ghost of that memory refused to leave her. She had been so drunk she thought I was Justin, and I had been too weak to stop her from pulling me into her bed. I remember waking up the next morning and seeing her confused expression, but I never offered a single word of explanation for what had happened. I had simply gotten dressed in silence and gone downstairs to make her favorite breakfast as if nothing had changed. From that point on, I had been the one to guide her through every intimate moment with a patience she had never acknowledged. The memory caused a sudden flush of heat to travel through her body, and she realized with a jolt that she hadn't seen me in a fortnight. She thought it was strange that I hadn't called once since the night I took the rap for Justin's accident. She assumed I was probably pining for her in some lonely apartment, too heartbroken to reach out while she was with her first love. She felt a surge of arrogance, convinced I was still waiting for her in the shadows. She compared my silence to Justin's constant presence and decided it was time to check in on her loyal assistant. She resolved to visit the Harrison headquarters the next day and bring along some expensive gifts to smooth things over. After all, she had promised to make up for the jail time she had forced me to endure. She saw it as a simple transaction to restore the balance in her life. Miriam stood at her vanity, her fingers trailing over her vast collection of diamonds before pausing on a sapphire set I had given her for her birthday. She was fastening the necklace when Justin entered the room and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. He asked if she had plans for the day, his voice thick with a forced sweetness. She looked at his reflection in the mirror, her mind already miles away. She looked at his hands and told him she needed to drop by the office to handle some business. Justin was curious, but she was blunt about her intentions to visit me and bring the gifts she had purchased at Sotheby's. She opened a velvet box containing a stunning emerald tie clip and diamond cufflinks that cost more than most people made in a year. There was also a pair of diamond bands that she had added to the set on a whim. Justin's eyes narrowed as he saw the diamond rings, his jealousy boiling beneath the surface of his polite smile. He suggested coming along, claiming he wanted to personally thank me for saving him from a prison sentence. Miriam didn't suspect his motives and agreed to let him join her for the trip to the tower. She thought it was a graceful gesture for them both to show their appreciation. The Maybach pulled up to the Harrison Group headquarters 30 minutes later, and the couple walked through the lobby hand in hand. The staff whispered as they passed, commenting on what a perfect pair they made and gossiping about the fortune she was spending on him. Miriam felt the eyes on her and enjoyed the spectacle of their public romance. They stepped into the private executive elevator, heading straight for the top floor. The doors chimed as they arrived at the executive level, revealing a bustling floor of high-level managers and assistants. Miriam scanned the area, but couldn't find me in my usual post near the entrance of her suite. Justin looked around with feigned curiosity, asking where my office was located. He noticed the glass-walled office next to Miriam's was completely bare, lacking even a stray piece of paper. Miriam was about to ask her secretary about my whereabouts when Justin suddenly cried out and stumbled. He clung to her arm, complaining that he had twisted his ankle on the marble floor. Miriam immediately knelt down to check on him, her worry taking precedence over everything else. Justin told her to go ahead and find me, playing the part of the selfless martyr while leaning heavily on her shoulder. Miriam refused to leave him and ordered a nearby junior assistant to take the jewelry boxes to my office. She instructed him to tell me they were a personal gift from her and that she would see me later. The assistant looked confused, repeating my name as if he hadn't heard it in a long time. Miriam's voice turned icy as she asked if he had a problem with a simple instruction. The terrified assistant stammered a frantic apology and took the boxes as Miriam led Justin back toward the elevators to find a doctor. The moment the doors closed, the entire floor erupted into frantic whispering. Everyone was stunned that Miriam was unaware of the fact that her right-hand man had resigned weeks ago. They realized I had vanished without a word and that my presence had been completely erased from the building while she was distracted by Justin. Justin refused to go to a clinic, claiming he was sick of hospitals and just needed some ice and rest at the mansion. Miriam agreed and spent the next several days focused entirely on nursing him back to health. Justin made sure to keep her busy with constant demands, ensuring she didn't have a moment to think about the office or my sudden disappearance. He was terrified of her finding out the truth. He mentioned a desire to see the Northern Lights, and Miriam immediately chartered a flight to Scandinavia just to please him. When he craved a specific pastry from a shop in Paris, she had it flown across the Atlantic on a private jet within 12 hours. She even abandoned her board meetings to comfort him through his nightmares, holding him until he drifted back to sleep. She was completely wrapped in his drama, oblivious to the void I had left behind. A full week passed without a single thought of me crossing her mind until they were attending a high-profile business gala. Justin suddenly suddenly doubled over in pain, his face turning pale as he clutched his stomach and moaned about his gastritis. Miriam was immediately by his side, her concern radiating through the room as he leaned heavily against her. He looked like he was about to collapse, his voice barely a whisper as he begged for help. Miriam suddenly remembered the many times she had suffered from similar stomach issues, and how I had always been there with a specific herbal broth to soothe the pain. She recalled one night when she was huddled on the sofa in agony, and I had stayed up to feed her the soup one spoonful at a time until she finally felt better. Instinctively, she pulled out her phone to call me, intending to order me to bring the same soup to the gala. She had forgotten for a moment that I wasn't there to save her. The phone rang until it hit voicemail, prompting her to dial again with a growing sense of frustration. On the third attempt, a recorded message informed her that the number had been deactivated and was no longer in service. She stared at the screen in total disbelief as the reality began to sink in. Her face turned pale with fury as she realized I hadn't just ignored her. I had erased her from my life entirely. She gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white, unable to comprehend why her loyal assistant would ever do something so drastic. She wondered if I was still bitter about the drunk driving incident, but she had already sent me a fortune in jewelry as an apology. The thought that I might have rejected her gifts, or worse, rejected her entirely, sent a cold wave of panic through her chest. It was a feeling she had never experienced in her privileged life. She had always seen me as a permanent fixture in her life, someone who knew his place and never made any demands or caused any trouble. A server interrupted her thoughts with a glass of warm water, and she snapped back to reality, handing the glass to Justin. She told him to drink it, her voice sounding hollow as she watched him sip the water. Her mind was already racing, trying to find an explanation for my silence. Justin took a few sips of water, but remained pale, asking if she could take him home so he could lie down. For the first time in their relationship, Miriam told him no, claiming she had an urgent business emergency that required her immediate attention. She instructed him to wait in a nearby hotel suite until the driver was available to take him back to the mansion. Justin was taken aback by her sudden coldness, but didn't dare argue, assuming the Harrison empire was facing a crisis. Miriam gave him a quick, distracted kiss on the forehead and promised to see him at home later that night. The moment she left the ballroom, she broke into a run toward the parking garage, ignoring the stares of the other guests. She tore out of the lot in the Maybach, driving like a woman possessed as she headed toward my apartment in Brooklyn. She arrived in record time, the car's tires shrieking as she slammed on the brakes in front of the building. Miriam was out of the car before the engine had even stopped, racing up the stairs of my building with a desperate energy. She pounded on my door, shouting my name into the empty hallway as the motion sensor lights flickered on and off. There was no answer from inside, only the heavy silence of an unoccupied space. She felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach as she stared at the familiar wood of the door. She stood in the dark hallway, her breathing ragged as she struggled to understand why I was ignoring her so completely. She couldn't wrap her head around the idea that I had blocked her and refused to answer my door. Suddenly, the neighbor's door cracked open and a young man poked his head out to complain about the noise. He looked annoyed until he saw the expensive clothes and the sheer desperation on Miriam's face. Miriam gave him a look so frigid that he stopped talking mid-sentence, his bravado vanishing in an instant. She asked him through gritted teeth about the resident of apartment 1203, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. The man blinked and told her that the guy in that unit had moved out weeks ago. The words felt like a physical blow to her chest, making her world spin. The revelation that I had moved out hit her like a lightning strike, leaving her momentarily speechless. She demanded to know exactly when I had left, and the neighbor recalled seeing me with a suitcase about 2 weeks prior. Miriam's heart sank as she realized that the timeline matched exactly with the day I had taken the blame for the accident. I hadn't just gone into hiding, I had completely abandoned my old life. Miriam stood frozen in the hallway as a wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over her. She couldn't understand why I would leave without saying anything when I had always shared every detail of my life with her. She turned and ran back to the Maybach, driving like a lunatic back toward the Harrison Group headquarters. Her mind was a chaotic mess of questions and regret as she pushed the car to its limit. She reached the executive floor with a look on her face that sent a chill through the entire staff, causing them to stop what they were doing in terror. She marched straight to my old desk and found it completely barren of personal items. The only things left were the expensive jewelry boxes she had sent over, still sealed and untouched on the cold surface. It was a clear message that I wanted nothing of hers. Miriam demanded to know where I was, her voice vibrating with a dangerous edge that made the assistants tremble. She pointed to the gifts and asked why they they hadn't been delivered and why my desk was perpetually empty. No one dared to meet her eyes until she screamed at them to give her an answer. The silence on the floor was suffocating as everyone waited for someone else to speak. One of the younger assistants finally stammered out the truth, informing her that I had resigned and that she had personally approved the request. Miriam went completely still, unable to remember ever seeing a resignation letter from me. She snatched a tablet from the assistant's hands and began frantically scrolling through the Harrison Group's internal portal. Her fingers hammered against the screen as she searched for the record of the approval. The system log was undeniable, showing a resignation request submitted by Edward Hayes 1 month ago and approved by Miriam Harrison on the same day. She stared at the digital signature, her mind flashing back to the night of Justin's homecoming party. She realized she had been so distracted and overjoyed by his return that she had likely signed off on dozens of documents without even glancing at the names. She had accidentally authorized my exit from her life. The reality of what she had done finally hit her, and the tablet slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. She stood in the middle of the office, feeling the air leave her lungs as the weight of my absence finally registered. For over a decade, I had been the silent foundation of her world, and she had become so accustomed to my presence that she never entertained the thought of me leaving. She felt a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. She demanded to know why I had quit, but the assistant could only offer that I had seemed strangely calm and detached during the process. Miriam's knuckles turned white as she struggled with a sudden, violent burst of emotion. She screamed that I had no right to be calm before kicking an executive chair across the room with enough force to dent the metal. The crash echoed through the silent office, terrifying everyone present. The staff retreated in fear as Miriam paced like a caged animal, her chest heaving with a mixture of rage and a panic she couldn't yet name. She ordered them to use every resource the Harrison Group possessed to find my current location and contact information. She gave them exactly 30 minutes to produce a report or face termination. The assistants scrambled to their desks, terrified of the woman who was currently dismantling the office in her fury. 30 minutes later, the team returned with a confusing pile of travel records and social media sightings from around the globe. One report placed me in the Maldives just a week ago, while another showed me checking into a hotel in Paris only 48 hours earlier. The most recent airline data showed that I had boarded a flight to Zurich just yesterday morning. I was moving across the world at a pace that made me nearly impossible to pin down. The lead assistant explained that I was likely using local burner phones in every country, making it impossible for them to establish a permanent line of communication. Miriam stared at the chaotic map of my movements, her head throbbing as she realized the sheer effort I was putting into staying hidden. It was obvious to her now that I wasn't just on a vacation. I was methodically erasing every trace of my connection to her. Her eyes locked onto the Swiss flight record, her fingers tapping a frantic rhythm against the desk. She ordered her private flight crew to prep the jet for an immediate departure to Zurich. Her secretary tried to remind her of a crucial board of directors meeting scheduled for the next morning, but Miriam cut her off with a snarl. She told them to cancel everything, making it clear that finding me was her only priority. She grabbed her designer coat and stormed out of the suite, already barking orders into her phone to get the pilots ready for an overnight flight. As she headed toward the elevator, she was consumed by a whirlwind of confusion and anger, unable to understand why I had abandoned her so abruptly. She felt like a part of her soul was missing, and she was willing to burn down her entire schedule just to get me back. She wondered if I was truly that petty over the drunk driving incident, even after she had promised to make it right. In a desperate attempt to fix things with money, she contacted her lawyers and instructed them to purchase a private island in my name. Her butler hurried along behind her, trying to keep up with her frantic pace as she finalized the $1 million transaction through her phone. She thought that if she could just buy my forgiveness, everything would return to normal. The butler informed her that the jet was fueled and ready for takeoff at Teterboro. She was stepping into her car when Justin's voice called out from the shadows of the parking garage. She turned to see him standing there, looking pale and confused as he asked her why she was leaving so suddenly. Miriam's patience was already wearing thin, and his presence only added to her agitation. Justin was shivering in the cold night air, wearing nothing but a thin shirt as he explained that he had been waiting for her at the mansion. He told her that he had called the office and found out she was heading to Switzerland to track me down. He argued that after 12 years of service, it was perfectly normal for an assistant to want a break, and asked why she was so desperate to drag me back. He was clearly threatened by the idea of me returning to her side. Miriam's response was sharp and dismissive, stating simply that I belonged by her side, and that was all there was was to it. Justin was stunned into silence, never having seen this side of her before. She didn't give him room to argue, telling him that he was too sick to be outside in the cold before ordering the driver to take him back to the estate. She was finished playing the devoted nurse. Justin refused to be left behind, grabbing her arm and insisting that he come along on the trip if she was so determined to leave. Miriam was about to snap at him to get out, but the ticking clock and the fear of me vanishing again made her hesitate. She decided it wasn't worth the argument and climbed into the back seat beside him, her mind already halfway to Zurich. She was too obsessed with her target to worry about Justin's jealousy. Once they were airborne, Justin stared in shock at the dozens of luxury shopping bags and gift boxes cluttering the cabin of the jet. He asked if all of those treasures were intended for me, and Miriam didn't even look up from her tablet as she confirmed it. She said that since she had upset me, it was only natural that she bring some incentives to win me back. Justin felt a cold knot of resentment growing in his chest as he realized the depth of her fixation. Justin's nails dug into his palms as he tried to reclaim her attention by complaining about his lingering stomach pain. Miriam didn't even glance his way, telling him to just deal with it until they reached their destination. He suggested having the captain divert the flight for medical attention, but she shut him down instantly, stating that nothing was more important than finding me. Justin fell into a sullen silence, realizing he was no longer the center of her universe. Miriam spent the entire 12-hour flight glued to her flight tracker and the updates from her investigators, terrified that I would slip away again. The jet landed in Geneva, and she rushed to the luxury hotel where I had last been spotted, her security team trailing behind her. The clerk at the front desk delivered the news that nearly broke her, informing her that Edward Hayes had checked out the previous afternoon. She had missed me by less than 24 hours. Miriam slammed her fist onto the marble counter in a fit of rage, sending the hotel staff scrambling for safety. She immediately called her office and demanded a new location, her voice echoing through the lobby. 10 minutes later, her assistant reported that I had boarded a morning flight to Reykjavik. Without a word to Justin, she turned and stormed back toward the airport, determined to catch me before I could vanish again. She gave the order to depart for Iceland immediately, ignoring Justin's pleas for a few hours of sleep. He was visibly exhausted, his eyes red from lack of rest. But Miriam didn't even look back as she boarded the jet. She told him that if he couldn't keep up, he was free to go home, but she wasn't stopping for anything. Justin followed her like a beaten dog, his resentment toward me deepening with every mile we flew. Justin was bewildered by the sudden change in her personality, unable to grasp how his devoted girlfriend had become so obsessed with a mere assistant. After another long haul across the Atlantic, they landed in Iceland, and Justin was so fatigued he could barely stand. Miriam ignored his state entirely, rushing to the hotel where I had been staying. She was single-minded in her pursuit, her eyes fixed on the goal of bringing me back under her control. The hotel staff in Reykjavik informed her that I had checked out that morning, mentioning that I was heading to Norway to see the Northern Lights. Miriam's expression was terrifying as she turned on her heel and headed back to the tarmac. Justin finally reached his breaking point, grabbing her arm and begging for a break after days of constant travel. He was on the verge of collapse, but Miriam looked like she hadn't even felt the fatigue. Miriam violently shook off his grip and told him once again that he was free to stay behind if he couldn't handle the pace. She marched toward the jet without looking back, leaving him standing alone on the frozen tarmac. Justin felt tears of frustration and jealousy welling up as he realized that her entire world now revolved around finding me. She was obsessed to the point of madness, and he was nothing more than an afterthought in her search. They spent the next week chasing my ghost across the European continent, always arriving just hours after I checked out. Every concierge and desk clerk gave her the same infuriating answer, that I had just departed for a new destination. When the news came that I had flown to the Maldives, Miriam ordered the jet to be prepped for the long flight south. Justin finally snapped, gripping her wrist with a desperate strength as he tried to stop the madness. Justin screamed at her to stop the search, arguing that I was clearly just on a world tour and would eventually come home. Miriam's response was a cold dismissal, stating that she couldn't wait another second to find me. Justin's voice shook as he asked why she was so obsessed with an assistant she used to call a brother. He was desperate for an answer that would make sense of the nightmare she had turned their relationship into. Miriam seemed to be in a trance, whispering to herself about how I should have been experiencing those beautiful places with her. She looked haunted by the fact that I had chosen to see the world without her. Justin began to sob, screaming at her to finally admit what I meant to her. He demanded that she look him in the eye and confess her true feelings for the man she was chasing across the planet. The question seemed to strike her like a physical blow, leaving her frozen at the base of the jet stairs. She was forced to confront the depth of her feelings for the first time in her life. For 12 years, I had been the air she breathed and the shadow that followed her, a constant presence she had taken for granted. She realized that she had never truly imagined a world where I didn't exist to catch her when she fell. The pilot interrupted her introspection to inform her that they were cleared for departure. Miriam snapped out of her daze and shoved Justin away, telling him she didn't have time for his questions. She told him that if he wanted a breakup, he could have it, and that as far as she was concerned, they were finished. Her only focus was getting back on that plane to find me, and Justin was no longer part of the equation. Her mind was focused on a single, obsessive goal, bringing me back home where I belonged. Justin watched in horror as she fled up the stairs, screaming her name until his voice cracked. Miriam didn't even pause, her pace quickening until she was safely inside the aircraft. When the heavy door slammed shut, Justin collapsed onto the tarmac, realizing he had lost the only person he had ever truly wanted. Justin finally understood that I had never been just a brother figure to Miriam. I was the foundation of her entire emotional life. On the jet, Miriam stared at the new data showing I had booked a 7-day stay at a resort in the Maldives. Her fingers traced the flight path on the screen as if she could reach out and touch me. Her butler assured her that I was unlikely to move again so quickly, giving her the chance she had been waiting for. Miriam gave a distracted nod as she stared out at the endless clouds, her body finally beginning to feel the weight of the week's travel. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that was bothering her, but Justin's haunting question about her true feelings for me. A torrent of memories began to flood her mind, spanning back to our childhood and every moment we had shared. She was beginning to see the patterns of a devotion she had been too blind to recognize. She remembered being 13 and trapped in an alley by bullies, and how I had charged in with a brick to save her despite being outnumbered. On her 14th birthday, I had found her wandering the streets after a fight with her father and carried her home on my back for 2 miles. When she had her first real heartbreak at 20, she had sobbed in my chest for hours while I held her in silence. I had always been her protector, her anchor, and her constant comfort in every storm. She realized that no matter how reckless she was, I was always the lighthouse waiting for her in the dark. The memory of our last encounter at the office tower came back to her with a painful clarity. I had stood there on the sidewalk as she rushed away to find Justin, and I had whispered a final goodbye that she hadn't even bothered to acknowledge. She felt a sickening regret as she realized she had ignored the last words I ever intended to say to her. The weight of that goodbye felt like a stone in her chest as she yelled at the pilots to make the plane go faster. The captain apologized over the intercom, informing her that they were already pushing the jet to its maximum cruising speed. Miriam slumped back in her leather seat, falling into a brooding silence as the vast ocean passed beneath them. She was a woman racing against time to fix a lifetime of mistakes. She kept her eyes fixed on the forward cabin as if her sheer willpower could push the aircraft to move faster through the sky. Thousands of miles away, I was waking up in a sun-drenched resort room in the Maldives, the light filtering through soft linen curtains. I stretched and realized that for the first time in over a decade, I didn't feel the crushing weight of someone else's expectations on my shoulders. I felt truly, wonderfully light. My month of travel had taken me from the fjords of Iceland to the cafes of Paris and the vast plains of the Serengeti. Every new horizon seemed to scrub away another layer of the resentment and exhaustion I had carried for 12 years. I was about to get out of bed to open the curtains when a soft hand reached out from under the duvet and yanked me back onto the mattress. I laughed as I was pulled back into the warmth of the expensive linens. A husky, sleepy voice murmured in my ear that it was far too early to be awake and begged me to stay for a while longer. I froze in place and turned to see a breathtakingly beautiful woman lying beside me, her eyes filled with a playful, teasing light. She possessed a striking elegance that rivaled Miriam's, but with an edge of maturity that was entirely new to me. I sat up and asked her who she was and how she had gotten into my private suite. The woman sat up, pulling the silk sheet to cover herself while giving me a look of amused skepticism. She asked if I was certain this was my room, which prompted me to scramble out of bed and look around the living area. I realized with a shock that I wasn't in the standard ocean view suite I had booked, but a massive, hyper-luxurious penthouse. It seemed my late-night return after a few too many drinks had led me to the wrong floor. I had clearly been more intoxicated than I realized and stumbled into the wrong suite in my drunken haze. The woman leaned against the door frame with a knowing smirk and asked if my memory was finally returning to me. I took a deep breath and asked why she hadn't just kicked me out when I invaded her space. She laughed and adjusted the collar of her robe, her eyes eyes never leaving mine. She told me that I had stumbled in and treated her like a giant pillow, refusing to let go no matter how much she protested. She pointed to a few faint marks on her neck and jokingly suggested that I must have been dreaming about mountain climbing given how hard I was clinging to her. I felt a wave of intense embarrassment wash over me, wishing I could simply vanish through the floor. I couldn't believe I had made such a fool of myself. Her fluent English was a small comfort in the middle of the disaster, and I began stammering out a series of apologies. I offered to pay for the suite and any medical bill she might have, reaching for a notepad to write down my contact information. I started to introduce myself as Edward, but she interrupted me by reciting my full name with perfect accuracy. I froze, my pen hovering over the paper as I looked at her with newfound suspicion. I looked up in shock and asked how she knew who I was. She smiled and asked if I had really forgotten our previous encounters, which prompted me to study her features more closely. The recognition hit me like a physical force when she mentioned the Thorne family gala from the previous spring. This was Victoria Thorne, the brilliant and formidable heiress to the Thorne multinational empire. She was the crown jewel of the Charleston Thornes, a few years older than Miriam and exactly my age. I remembered being at the gala as an assistant, spending the entire night catering to Miriam's whims while Victoria watched the room with a calculating gaze. I addressed her as Miss Thorne with a newfound sense of formality, and she smiled, seemingly pleased that I had finally placed her. She told me she was impressed. I remembered her given how busy I had been that night. I informed her that I was no longer with the Harrison group, which prompted her to stand up and move toward me with a predatory grace. She said my resignation was the perfect opportunity for her to finally poach the most talented executive in the city. She offered to double my previous salary if I joined her firm, her presence filling the room as she moved into my personal space. I took a step back, feeling a strange tension I wasn't ready to deal with. I told her that I wasn't looking for a career change and planned to continue my travels for the foreseeable future. I apologized one last time for the intrusion and offered to make it up to her in any way she saw fit. As I turned to leave, she blocked my path at the door, her eyes burning with an intensity that made me pause. She reminded me that a woman of her status didn't need money or professional favors from me. I asked her what she could possibly want from me if not money or a job, and she looked me dead in the eye with a terrifyingly serious expression. She told me that what she lacked was a partner and asked if I would consider filling the role. I was completely speechless, asking if this was some kind of elaborate prank. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute conviction as she asked if she looked like a woman who played games with her heart. I pointed out that she could have any man in the country and asked why she would ever settle for someone like me. Victoria stepped closer, a small smile returning to her lips as she told me that the answer was simple. She liked me. I stared at her, feeling a sudden, uncharacteristic wave of panic at her directness. I insisted that she must be making fun of me, unable to process the idea of someone like her being genuinely interested. Victoria laughed softly and told me that she never joked about her emotions, her tone making it clear she meant every word. I argued that we were essentially strangers who had only met twice in passing. She corrected me immediately, stating that we had actually crossed paths 3 times, even if I only remembered 2 of them. Her memory for our history was unsettlingly precise. She recalled the first time in Charleston, describing the Navy suit I wore and how I had spent the night trailing after Miriam like a lost puppy. She even remembered that I had developed a severe allergic reaction after drinking for Miriam when she was too drunk to continue. It was a detail I hadn't shared with anyone, and yet she had seen it all from across the ballroom. She mentioned our second encounter at a global summit in Tokyo, where I had given a presentation on high-stakes mergers. She described the black suit I wore and complimented the brilliance of my analysis, admitting she had been captivated by my professionalism. She even remembered how I had gracefully handled a difficult international client after the session, leaving her thoroughly impressed with my character and composure. She concluded by saying that our third meeting was currently taking place in her suite. I was left completely stunned by her memory and the blunt honesty of her confession. She explained that she had stayed away for years because of the rumors that I was hopelessly in love with Miriam. It seemed she had been waiting for the moment I finally broke free. She told me that my resignation was the signal she had been waiting for to finally make her move. I was overwhelmed by her intensity, but a sudden realization hit me like a ton of bricks. A woman who ran a global empire didn't just end up in the Maldives by accident, and she certainly wasn't here for a standard vacation. I began to suspect that our accidental meeting was anything but. I looked her in the eyes and asked if she had been following me across the globe. She shrugged and told me that stalking was such an ugly word, preferring to say she had simply pursued pursued me across international borders. She admitted with a laugh that she had chased me through 7 different countries before finally catching up to me here. Her dedication was both flattering and terrifying. She assured me that the previous night's encounter had been a genuine accident, as she had planned a much more formal reintroduction. She gave a suggestive look at the rumpled bedsheets and joked that she never expected me to take the initiative by breaking into her room. I felt another wave of heat rush to my face and quickly tried to change the subject before things got even more awkward. I told her once again that I wasn't looking for a relationship, but she didn't seem bothered by the rejection in the slightest. She calmly stated that while I could say no to being her boyfriend, I couldn't stop her from trying to win me over. Her confidence was unshakable, leaving me with no way to argue my way out of the situation. I mumbled a vague excuse and fled the suite as quickly as I could. An hour later, I left my room to grab some dinner, only to find Victoria leaning against the opposite wall as if she had been waiting for me. She greeted me with a dazzling smile and suggested we eat together, anticipating my refusal before I could even speak. She argued that since we were going to the same resort restaurant anyway, it would be cruel of me to make her dine alone. I found myself unable to say no to her persistent charm. I gave in and allowed her to walk with me along the moonlit beach toward the restaurant. The sea breeze was unruly, and at one point, a tiny bit of downy fluff got caught in my eyelashes. I reached up to clear it, but Victoria was faster, telling me to stay still as she did it for me. Her touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the demanding nature of the woman I had spent 12 years serving. I found myself holding my breath as she leaned in close, the scent of her perfume mixing with the salt air in a way that felt intoxicating. Our moment was shattered by a scream of pure rage from behind us, demanding to know what the hell we were doing. I turned around to find Miriam standing a few yards away, her face contorted with a fury so intense it was almost palpable. I was completely stunned, unable to fathom how she had tracked me to this remote corner of the world. Before I could even react, Miriam had bridged the gap and shoved herself between us, pulling me behind her as if I were a possession. She growled to Victoria to stay away from her man, her voice trembling with possessive rage. Victoria just calmly smoothed out the fabric of her dress and reminded Miriam that I was no longer her employee or her property. The tension between the two powerful women was enough to set the air on fire. Miriam snarled that she had never truly agreed to my resignation, but I pulled my hand out of her grip and met her eyes with a cold stare. I reminded her that she had personally clicked the approval button on my digital request and that my departure was final. My words seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and the fire in her eyes was replaced by a look of profound, agonizing disbelief. She looked like she was seeing me for the first time. Normally, the sound of her voice was enough to soften my anger, but now I felt nothing but a hollow irritation. I asked her why she was even there, and she reached for me again, insisting that she had come to take me home where I belonged. I stepped back, out of her reach, and told her in no uncertain terms that I was never going back with her. She raised her voice, starting to say she was my boss, but the words died in her throat as she realized that title no longer carried any weight. I cut her off before she could finish, reminding her that our professional relationship was dead and buried. I turned my back on her and began walking away, done with the conversation and the drama. Victoria lingered for a second, giving Miriam a look of triumph and pity before casually following after me. Miriam remained frozen on the beach, her knuckles white as she watched us walk away together into the night. She felt a desperate urge to run after me and drag me back, but the memory of the sheer coldness in my eyes kept her rooted to the spot. Instead, she went to the resort's reception and used her family name to force them to give her the suite directly adjacent to mine. Once inside, she threw her coat onto the sofa in a fit of frustration, haunted by the realization that I looked at her like she was a complete stranger. The distance between us was now greater than any ocean. Miriam felt a physical pain in her chest, a crushing agony that made it difficult for her to even draw a breath. She called her friend again, her voice sounding broken as she described the visceral jealousy she felt seeing me with Victoria. She admitted that the thought of me never coming back felt like a knife being twisted in her gut, and asked what such a feeling meant. She was finally beginning to understand the reality of her own heart. Her friend laughed over the phone and told her that the answer was obvious. She was in love with me. The words hit Miriam with the force of a tidal wave, making her grip on the phone falter as she processed the truth. She repeated the words in love to herself, the concept feeling both foreign and terrifyingly right. She finally realized that the man she had treated as an accessory was actually the center of her world. Justin's earlier accusation echoed in her mind, reminding her that she had completely fallen apart the moment I vanished. vanished. She realized that despite her supposed love for Justin, she had never once considered chasing him across the globe during his years abroad. Yet, I had been gone for only a few weeks, and she had abandoned everything to follow me through 7 countries. Her heart was racing as the undeniable truth of her obsession became clear. A strange sense of euphoria began to mix with her panic as she convinced herself that everything could be fixed now that she knew the truth. She believed that because she loved me and was certain I felt the same, a simple confession would be enough to bring me back. She imagined us being together forever, a delusional hope blooming in her chest like a wildfire. She was convinced that our history was too strong for me to truly walk away from her. Later that night, Miriam stood outside my suite and knocked on the door, her voice trembling as she asked to speak with me. She got no response, even after she insisted she knew I was inside listening to her. She tried calling my phone again, only to be met with the same cold, automated message informing her that my number was out of service. Her desperation was growing with every passing second of silence. Miriam snarled into the phone and called the front desk, demanding a duplicate key to my suite. When the clerk tried to refuse, she used her family name like a weapon, reminding them that she was a major shareholder in the resort's parent company. 5 minutes later, she was standing in front of my door with a key card in hand. She took a deep breath and swiped the card, the lock clicking open with a soft beep. The suite was dimly lit and seemed empty until she spotted my suitcase in the corner. She heard the sound of the shower running and felt a wave of relief as she approached the bathroom door. She told me through the door that we needed to talk, but the water stopped instantly, followed by my voice telling her to leave. I sounded so calm and detached that it made her blood run cold. Miriam refused to move, stating that she had something life-changing to confess to me about her feelings. I cut her off immediately, telling her that I had no interest in anything she had to say, and once again ordered her to get out. She felt as if the air had been kicked out of her lungs, unable to believe that I was truly shutting her out. She asked if I was really going to deny her the chance to explain herself. I used her first name for the first time in over a decade, my voice cutting through her desperate pleas like a blade. I asked her when she had ever truly stopped to consider what I wanted instead of just what I could do for her. The question was a devastating truth that left her speechless and gasping for air. She realized in that moment that she had never once asked me about my own dreams or desires. The reality of our dynamic was undeniable. I'd spent my entire adult life catering to her every whim while she gave me nothing but in paycheck and orders. Miriam tried to apologize for her past behavior, but the bathroom door opened before she could finish her sentence. I stood there in nothing but a bathrobe, my damp hair clinging to my forehead as I looked at her with a profound weariness. I was finished with her apologies and her games. I told her that apologies were unnecessary because our entire relationship had been a simple business transaction from the start. Miriam looked confused, asking what I meant by transaction. I explained that my presence in her life was the price paid to keep my father's firm afloat, and that now the debt had been settled. I made it clear that I was finally free of the contract that had bound us together. The word transaction seemed to shatter her heart, causing her to stagger back as if I had struck her. I repeated the sentiment slowly, making sure she understood that my entire motivation for being with her was purely financial. The silence in the room was deafening as she stared at me, her eyes searching for any sign that I was lying. She looked like her entire world had just been dismantled in a few short sentences. She searched my face for a flicker of emotion or a hint of a bluff, but found nothing but a wall of cold indifference. That lack of feeling was what finally terrified her, because it meant I had truly moved on. She stammered that it was impossible to try and bring up our past, but I interrupted her with a harsh laugh. I asked her exactly what she thought she knew about a man who was paid to be by her side. I pointed out that my compliance and devotion were merely parts of the job I was hired to do to secure her family's investment. Miriam was breathing hard, her voice trembling as she asked if I had truly felt nothing for her during our 12 years together. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that I hadn't felt a single shred of genuine affection for her. The lie was necessary to finally break the bond between us. My words were a finishing blow that seemed to tear her heart apart. She was flooded with memories of me staying up all night during her fevers and holding her while she sobbed over her first heartbreak. She even thought of the night she had mistaken me for Justin and how I hadn't pushed her away. She struggled to reconcile those moments of tenderness with the cold, mercenary man standing before her. Miriam lunged forward and gripped my wrist, screaming that I was a liar and demanding to know why I would do those things if I didn't love her. I didn't pull away, looking at her with a detachment that made her seem like a complete stranger. I told her that the only reason I had stayed was to pay for my mother's life-saving treatments, a debt my father had used to keep me in her service. My entire life had been a series of sacrifices for a family that didn't deserve me. Miriam's grip slowly faltered until her hand fell uselessly to her side. She looked like she had just realized that her entire history of love was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. She whispered that she didn't believe me, begging me to look her in the eye and say it again. I simply sighed and suggested she go talk to my father if she wanted the cold, hard proof of my contract. I told her to ask him about the day he sold his 15-year-old son to the Harrison family just to save his failing business. I explained that the agreement was simple. I was to please her and keep her happy in exchange for the capital that saved my family's firm. I challenged her to hear the truth from his own mouth, knowing that he would be all too happy to explain the business deal that had defined my life. Miriam was as pale as a ghost, her voice barely a rasp as she asked if my years of devotion and our nights together were truly all for a paycheck. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before giving her a firm, clear nod of confirmation. That single yes seemed to break something deep inside her, as if the foundation of her entire world had finally given way. She looked utterly destroyed. She stumbled backward and knocked over a glass table, the shattering sound echoing through the suite like a gunshot. The noise seemed to bring her back to the present, and she looked at my cold face before letting out a hollow, broken laugh. She mocked my impressive commitment to the lie and called me the most heartless man she had ever met. She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the heavy door so hard the walls vibrated. I remained standing in the middle of the room, finally letting out the breath I had been holding since she walked in. I heard her footsteps fading down the hallway until there was nothing left but silence. Meanwhile, Miriam collapsed onto her bed in the next room, staring at the ceiling with unseeing eyes. My cold face and my brutal words were on a constant loop in her mind, tearing into her heart with every repetition. The agony she felt wasn't just from the truth I'd told her, but from the fact that even knowing it, she still couldn't stop loving me. I eventually left my suite and found Victoria waiting for me at the end of the hall, her expression unreadable. I gave her a tired nod, feeling a profound sense of emotional exhaustion that made my bones ache. I was finally done with the Harrisons. Victoria didn't push for details, simply stating that she had reserved a table at a secluded restaurant by the shore. We walked to the elevator in a comfortable silence, both of us choosing to leave Miriam's name unsaid. At dinner, she surprised me by ordering all of my favorite dishes and a rare vintage of red wine. She poured me a glass and told me it was the finest bottle in the house, clearly trying to distract me from the night's drama. The wine was excellent, and I could feel some of the tension finally leaving my body. Victoria eventually broke the silence by asking if the wine compared to the legendary collection in the Harrison cellars. I set my glass down and asked her to be direct about what she was actually curious about. She looked me in the eye and admitted that I looked like I had been through hell and wanted to know what Miriam had said to me. I gave her a hollow laugh and confessed that Miriam had actually declared her love for me after all those years. I explained that I had countered her confession with the brutal truth about our relationship being purely financial. Victoria swirled her wine and asked if Miriam had actually fallen for the lie. I told her that I had sent her to my father for the final proof, ensuring there was no turning back. Victoria noted that without the Harrison family's support, my father's firm would likely collapse within a month. I told her that his business failures were no longer my concern and that I had officially severed all ties with my family. Victoria was impressed by my resolve, but I reminded her that 12 years of my life was more than enough to settle any debt I owed them. I was finished being a martyr for people who only saw me as a commodity. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her touch warm and grounding. She asked what my plans were for the future, and I told her that I wanted to continue traveling and seeing the world. When she asked if I planned to do it alone, I looked up and met her intense gaze. I started to say her name, but she cut me off before I could offer another rejection. She told me to stop calling her Miss Thorne and to finally use her first name. I asked her once again what she could possibly see in me, especially given how little we knew each other. She laughed and told me she admired my strength and the way I carried my pain without letting it break me. She said she was captivated by the fact that I had managed to keep my sanity and my dignity despite everything Miriam had put me through. She finished by saying that she loved loved who I was and that she didn't need a list of reasons to feel the way she did. I felt my heart skip a beat at her words, but our moment was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance of the restaurant. I turned to see Miriam standing there, her face a mask of cold fury as she began marching toward our table. She looked like she was ready to start a war in the middle of the resort. Miriam demanded that I speak with her, but Victoria stood up and blocked her path, informing her that I was currently on a date. Miriam was so enraged, she actually swung a punch at Victoria, who easily dodged the blow and caught Miriam's wrist in a firm grip. Victoria told her to keep her composure and reminded her that they were in a public place. The two women stood face to face, the air thick with hostility. Miriam wrenched her arm away and threw herself at me, sobbing as she clung to my shirt. She confessed that she had spoken to my father and that he had confirmed the business deal, but she told me through her tears that she didn't care about the money. She was completely broken, her pride gone, as she begged me to listen to her. I felt the heat of her tears through my clothes, but I remained as still as a statue. She cried that she didn't care about my motives for approaching her and that her love for me was the only thing that mattered. She begged me to come back to her, her voice sounding like that of a lost child in a way that I had never heard before. The proud, arrogant Miriam Harrison was gone, replaced by a desperate woman who was willing to crawl just for a hint of my affection. It was a pathetic and heartbreaking sight, but it was too late for pity. I took a slow breath and carefully pried her fingers off my arms one by one. I told her as gently as I could that I had absolutely no interest in her and that she needed to move on with her life. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, not stopping until I was far away on the beach. Victoria caught up to me and asked if I was doing okay after the confrontation. I admitted that I just wanted to go back to my suite and forget the entire night had happened. As I reached for my door, Victoria placed her hand over mine and asked me once more to be her boyfriend. I looked at her and reminded her that I had already given her an answer. I was certain she was expecting another rejection. Victoria just smiled and told me that I was going to say yes because the relationship would be a fabrication. She stepped into my personal space, pinning me against the door as she explained her plan. She suggested that if we pretended to be together, Miriam would finally lose hope and stop her obsessive pursuit. It was a tactical move that benefited us both. She promised that once our relationship was public, Miriam's pride would eventually force her to give up. I could feel her breath against my skin, and my heart began to race in a way that I couldn't ignore. I joked that she was just trying to take advantage of my situation, and she admitted it with a playful smirk. She asked for my final answer, her eyes challenging me to take the risk. I looked into her beautiful eyes and finally allowed myself to smile back. I told her that it would be an honor to be used by someone as brilliant as her. Victoria's smile widened as she whispered that the pleasure was all hers. In that moment, the deal was struck and the game had officially begun. 3 days later, Miriam found us on the resort grounds, but her anger was replaced by shock when she saw our hands locked together. I introduced Victoria as my new girlfriend, my voice sounding steady and certain. Miriam stared at our joined hands as the color drained from her face once more. She asked when this had happened, her voice barely a whisper. Victoria pulled me closer and told her that our relationship had begun just a few days ago. She mockingly asked if Miriam was going to offer us her congratulations. Miriam stared at me, searching for any sign that we were lying, but I kept my expression as unreadable as a stone wall. She eventually let out a manic laugh, claiming she didn't believe me and accusing me of staging the whole thing just to hurt her. I draped my arm around Victoria and told Miriam she was free to believe whatever made her feel better before excusing us from the conversation. For the rest of the week, Miriam became completely obsessed, sending flowers to my room until I had the resort block the deliveries. When the flowers were returned, she switched to sending gourmet snacks that she remembered were my favorites. She was trying to buy her way back into my life, one gift at a time. She followed our itinerary and began staging accidental run-ins at the pool and the restaurants. She even cornered me while Victoria was away, begging for forgiveness and a second chance at our relationship. She looked like a shell of her former self, her eyes constantly red from crying as she pleaded with me to come home. It was a pathetic display of regret that came 12 years too late. She asked me what she had to do to prove her love, but I met her desperation with nothing but a cold indifference. Victoria and I continued our charade of a happy couple, making sure Miriam saw every kiss and every touch. Our game came to an abrupt end one afternoon when I was ambushed by a group of hired thugs outside the resort entrance. I realized too late that Justin had finally run out of patience. A cloth soaked in chemicals was shoved over my face before I could even shout for help. I tried to fight back, but the fumes quickly overwhelmed me and the world went dark. When I finally regained consciousness, I found myself bound to a wooden chair in the middle of a derelict derelict warehouse. A voice from the shadows asked if I was finally awake, and I felt a cold dread settle in my bones. Justin stepped into the light with a manic grin on his face that made him look like a complete stranger. I struggled to speak through my dry throat, reminding him that kidnapping was a federal offense that would ruin his life. He screamed at me that I was the one who was crazy for thinking I could take everything from him. He admitted to his insanity, his eyes wide and vacant as he paced around my chair. He ranted about how Miriam had dumped him and how I was the one responsible for his downfall. He grabbed my hair and screamed about his lifelong devotion to her, claiming he had waited for years to finally have her. He spoke about how perfect their relationship had been before I decided to leave and ruin everything. He was a man who had lost his only anchor and was now drifting into a violent madness. He blamed my departure for Miriam's sudden change of heart and the collapse of his perfect life. I told him through my teeth that love couldn't be forced, which earned me a violent slap across the face that left my head ringing. He was about to strike me again when the warehouse doors were kicked off their hinges and Miriam stormed into the building. She looked like an avenging angel, her eyes fixed on Justin with a terrifying intensity. She screamed at Justin to let me go, but he just turned to her with that same sickening grin and told her he had been waiting for her. When she saw me bruised and bound to the chair, she turned deathly pale. She demanded to know what he had done to me, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and absolute fury. The three of us were trapped in a nightmare of his making. Justin pulled a folding knife from his pocket and stated calmly that he was going to erase me from existence. Miriam tried to reason with him, begging him not to throw his life away over a moment of madness. He just laughed and told her that I had already destroyed everything he cared about. He raised the knife and lunged toward my chest with a scream of pure, unadulterated hatred. He yelled that once I was gone, she would have no choice but to return to him. Miriam didn't hesitate, throwing herself between us as the blade descended. I watched in horror as the knife buried itself in her abdomen and blood began to soak through her expensive dress. It was a moment of selfless courage that I never expected from a woman like her. Justin let out a terrified shriek as the knife fell from his trembling hands, the reality of what he had done finally piercing his madness. Miriam collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching the wound as the crimson stain grew larger on her white silk. She ignored her own pain and looked at me, asking with a weak voice if I was unhurt. She was dying, and her only concern was my safety. I fought against my restraints, screaming for her to stay with me as the sirens outside became a deafening roar. Justin was huddled on the floor in a catatonic state, mumbling over and over that he hadn't meant to hurt her. Within seconds, the warehouse was swarmed by officers who tackled Justin to the ground and dragged him out in handcuffs. The nightmare was finally ending, but the cost was more than I could bear. Paramedics rushed to her side, working frantically to stabilize her before lifting her onto a stretcher and rushing her to the waiting ambulance. I was finally freed from my chair and followed the convoy to the hospital, my clothes soaked in her blood. I sat on a hard plastic bench in the waiting room, my entire body shaking with a mixture of shock and terror as I waited for news from the surgeons. Victoria arrived shortly after, her face pale with worry as she wrapped her arms around me and whispered that it was finally over. I leaned into her, letting her strength keep me from collapsing as the hours ticked by in a blur of sterile corridors and muffled voices. After an agonizing 5-hour surgery, the light finally turned green and the doctor informed us that Miriam would survive. He warned us that the recovery would be long and difficult, but the immediate danger had passed. I let out a shaky breath of relief as Victoria helped me to my feet, suggesting that I go in and see Miriam. I hesitated for a moment before deciding that it was better if I stayed away for her own sake. Victoria was confused, but I explained that seeing me would only prolong her obsession and keep her from moving on. My presence had become a poison to her, and the kindest thing I could do was vanish. Victoria understood my reasoning and nodded, taking my hand as we walked out of the hospital toward a new future. She told me she would take me anywhere in the world I wanted to go, as long as it brought me peace. 3 months later, I was sitting in a street-side cafe in Paris, sipping an espresso and planning our next adventure. The nightmare of the Harrisons felt like a lifetime ago, a dark chapter that had finally been closed. I had spent the last 90 days traveling through the most beautiful cities in Europe before deciding to settle in Paris for a few weeks. Victoria joined me at the table with an iced latte, asking if I had decided on our next destination. When I reached for the drink, our fingers brushed together, and I felt a familiar jolt of electricity before pulling back. We were still navigating the boundaries of our complicated relationship. I admitted that I hadn't made a decision yet, which prompted Victoria to suggest a long stay stay at her family's estate in Provence. She described the vineyards and the ancient wine cellars with an infectious enthusiasm that almost convinced me to say yes. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, wondering if it was a ghost from my past. The voice on the other end belonged to the Harrison family butler, and he informed me that Miriam's father was desperate to speak with me. I reminded him that I had officially cut ties with the family months ago and had no interest in their affairs. The butler's voice turned somber as he told me that Miriam was gravely ill and was constantly calling for me in her delirium. He sounded genuinely terrified for her life. I reiterated that she meant nothing to me and that I was no longer responsible for her well-being. The butler insisted that this wasn't a trick and that her health was failing rapidly due to her refusal to eat or sleep. He begged me to come to New York, even if it was just for a single visit, to help her find the will to live. I hung up the phone, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest as I stared out at the river. A week later, I found myself standing in front of the massive Harrison estate in New York, feeling like a ghost returning to a haunted house. The grounds were as immaculate as ever, but the air felt heavy with a gloom that hadn't been there before. The butler led me to the library where Miriam's father was waiting, looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. He looked like a man who was losing everything he loved. Mr. Harrison admitted that Miriam was in a downward spiral and that medical science seemed unable to help her. I started to explain the history of our relationship, but he cut me off, stating that he knew everything but was convinced her love for me was real. He pleaded with me to see her, claiming that I was the only person left on earth who could reach her. I felt a surge of resentment that I was once again being used as her cure. He talked about how she had been spoiled her entire life, but that I was the only thing she truly valued. I told him that his daughter's realization had come far too late to save whatever we had. He handed me a thick leather folder and told me it contained everything she had done in my absence. I opened it with a sense of dread, wondering what new obsession she had funded in her grief. The first document was a signed agreement transferring her entire stake in the Harrison Group into my name, a move that made me one of the wealthiest men in the city. The second was the deed to the private island she had purchased during her frantic search for me. Her father explained that she had spent her entire recovery period traveling the globe trying to track me down, ignoring her own health in the process. He looked at me with a desperate hope, as if these gifts could buy my return. He told me that she had collapsed at JFK while trying to board a flight to Paris, suffering from a massive internal hemorrhage caused by severe stomach issues. My hands began to shake as I read the medical reports detailing her critical condition and her refusal to eat or rest. It seemed that in her obsession to find me, she had nearly killed herself through sheer neglect. Her father's voice was breaking as he described the scene at the hospital. Mr. Harrison confessed that she hadn't eaten a full meal since the day I walked away from her on the beach. I closed the folder and asked him what he truly expected from me after everything that had happened. He looked completely defeated as he asked me to simply visit her one last time as a favor to a desperate parent. I sat in silence for a long time before finally agreeing to go to her room. Miriam's bedroom was pitch black, the heavy curtains blocking out every hint of sunlight and the air smelling of stale alcohol. I found her curled in a fetal position on the bed, clutching an old denim jacket of mine like a security blanket. She didn't even look up when I entered, her voice sounding dead and flat as she told me to leave her alone. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. I remained standing at the foot of the bed until she finally looked up and saw me. She whispered my name as if she were seeing a vision, her eyes bloodshot and her face sunken from months of self-destruction. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt a pang of genuine sorrow as I looked at what she had become. For a moment, the old devotion flickered in my chest, but I quickly pushed it down. I asked her why she had done this to herself, my voice barely a whisper in the silent room. She lunged forward and gripped my wrist with a desperate, freezing strength that actually hurt. She kept asking if I was real, terrified that her mind was playing one final cruel trick on her. Her grip was like a vice, and I could feel her entire body trembling as she realized I was actually there. I assured her that I was real and gently tried to pull my hand away from her icy grasp. She refused to let go, her eyes searching mine for any sign of forgiveness or return to our old life. I told her that I had never truly been angry with her, which only seemed to make her more desperate. She wanted a passion that I could no longer give her. She demanded to know why I had left if I wasn't angry, asking if it was all because of Justin's return. She reminded me that she had dumped him and that he was gone forever, as if that would fix everything. I sighed and explained that Justin was never the root of our problem. I told her that our issues were internal, built on a foundation of control and manipulation that had nothing to do with outside forces. resources. Her voice was a ragged sob as she promised to change every part of herself to make me happy. She looked so broken that I found it difficult to maintain my cold demeanor, even though I knew I had to. I looked into her bloodshot eyes and saw a woman who was finally realizing the cost of her privilege. I stayed silent for a long time, unable to find the words to explain a decade of resentment. I told her that our entire foundation was built on a mistake and that there was nothing left to save. She threw herself into my arms and begged for a clean slate, promising that things would be different if I just gave her one more chance. I felt the familiar weight of her against me, but I pulled away and told her that her time had finally run out. The tragedy was that it took my departure for her to realize what she had lost. Miriam looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language when I mentioned that I had moved on with someone else. She whispered that I was lying and that she knew in her heart that I still loved her. She was clinging to a version of me that had died months ago, unable to accept that I had found a happiness that didn't include her. The silence in the room became absolute as she waited for me to tell her it was all a joke. I repeated the cold truth about my financial motivations, watching as a look of pure agony transformed her face. She stumbled backward and sent a lamp crashing to the floor, the sound of breaking ceramic mirroring the collapse of her hopes. I knelt down to gather the shards, my movements calm and mechanical. She watched me with a hollow expression, as if she were watching her entire life be swept away. I told her that it was time for both of us to find a new path forward, but she dropped to her knees and clung to my waist. She begged me not to leave her, her tears feeling like drops of fire against my skin as she sobbed into my lap. I had seen her cry many times over the years, but this was a raw, primal grief that I had never witnessed before. She was finally broken, stripped of all her Harrison arrogance. She listed every one of her mistakes through her tears, from the rooftop sacrifice to the drunk driving incident and her constant neglect. She begged for one more chance to prove she could be the person I deserved. I closed my eyes and hardened my heart one last time, gently but firmly pushing her away from me. I told her that while I appreciated her realization, it didn't change the fact that I was finished with her. I stood up and told her to take care of herself, giving her one final look before heading toward the door. I walked out of the room and through the mansion without turning back once, leaving the Harrison legacy behind for the last time. Miriam remained on the floor, watching me leave until the door clicked shut. She let out a final, haunting laugh that dissolved into a scream of pure, agonizing loss. She finally understood the agony of heartbreak that she had inflicted on so many others throughout her life. The night air was cool as I stepped out of the estate and into the quiet streets of the city. I stood under a street lamp and watched my long shadow, finally feeling like I belonged to myself. I received a text from Victoria asking if I had finally closed that chapter of my life, and I sent back a simple affirmation. Victoria asked what our next move was, and I told her I wanted to finish the world tour we had started. She responded instantly, stating that we were doing it together and that she was already packing her bags. I joked that she was still on a trial basis as my partner, and she replied with a confidence that made me smile. She promised me that she was willing to spend the rest of her life proving she was the right choice. I hailed a cab and sat back as the neon lights of Manhattan blurred past the window in a kaleidoscope of color. I looked at the skyscrapers and the streets where I had spent 27 years as a servant to a family that never truly saw me. I whispered a final goodbye to the city, feeling a profound sense of peace. This time, I was leaving for myself, and I was never coming back. This story is about far more than just the drama of an elite family. It is a narrative of a man awakening from being a mere shadow into finding his true self. Many people have found themselves playing the humble role of Edward in their own lives, offering absolute devotion only to be treated as an interchangeable cog in a machine or a sacrificial lamb on an altar. We frequently fall under the illusion that if we simply stay long enough or do enough, we will eventually be rewarded with reciprocal love. The harsh reality is that any relationship requiring you to bankrupt your self-respect just to keep it alive is not a sanctuary. It is a slow death. The true power of this story is not found in Miriam's desperate regret, but in the moment Edward finally chose to walk away for good. He teaches us that a person's ultimate strength is not found in how much they can endure, but in having the courage to leave at any moment. If you have ever felt belittled or overlooked, you must never doubt your inherent worth. You are never meant to be a convenient harbor for someone else's storms or a secondary choice in their life. The world is vast, and you deserve to be someone's primary and passionate choice. Sometimes the most profound act of love is not sacrificing yourself for another, but finally giving yourself permission to move on. When you stop treating the validation of others as your only source of oxygen, you will finally be be able to breathe for yourself.